Welcome to today's webinar. I am Bev Carlton, People Advisor to Team Ohana. In this series, we're talking to, dare I say, titans from heads of HR, heads of finance, and heads of talent acquisition. Today's guest is Eric Krash, and Eric Krash is leading global talent acquisition for WeightWatchers. One of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to Eric is I've worked with him for a number of years, and he's a true practitioner in how you think about what are the right KPIs and data sets for your business. And the way in which he thinks about it and brings it to its simplest form, I think is one of the most compelling things about the way he's created his career and what he brings to organizations. I'm super excited about the conversation. I hope you will be as well. And we look forward to hearing your comments when we're finished. Eric, it's so good to see you again.
Good to see you, Bev. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm excited. We have 30-ish minutes to spend together today. And one of the reasons that we were really excited to bring you on board, and I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing, because some of it's personal, as well as a review of your amazing career, is you have had such an interesting background when it comes to people, the combination of talent acquisition, HR, people strategy, and all of the data aspects of talent of what we do for a living. And in full disclosure, I've known Eric only for a couple of years. I hired Eric into a previous role, and quickly became friends. And I quickly assessed you were one of the smartest people I'd ever met. And so it's been an absolute pleasure to keep in touch with you, even as you moved on from that particular position. But one of there's so many things I want to talk about, but the one that I'm most excited about is your ability to really translate what you do every day from being a human being in the role and how complicated it is what we do and what we have to execute on, against some huge brands and huge experiences that you have. And you seem to navigate it really smoothly. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your tips and tricks, war wound, scar tissue, all of those really fun things that you've been able to do over the last decade. And we'll get right into it.
Great.
Okay. So before that's my view of Eric in the world, one of the smartest people I've ever met. But I'd love to hear from you, your elevator pitch or how you think about describing to anyone that you run into, what has your career looked like and what do you do today?
Well, first of all, the feeling is mutual, Bev. We could easily fill the 30 minutes with things I've learned from you, so don't want to gloss over that. Let's see, elevator pitch on career. The probably like first really formative experience was working at an RPO. So working as an agency, but fully embedded with a client or, a series of clients over time. With mostly clients that either were taking on some kind of strategic shift that meant that they weren't resourced internally in a way that would allow them to meet their hiring goals, or that needed to hire at scale, but for whatever reason, be it budget or specialization or whatever, didn't want to go the agency route and didn't want to kind of like rapidly hire an internal team. So those would typically be, the shortest deployments were probably like 3 months. The longest, there was a client I worked with for a year and a half. So awesome learning experience, everything from Fortune 100 companies down to 10-person startups. So that was a real sort of like trial by fire opportunity in terms of just working with a ton of different stakeholders at varying sizes and stages, who had completely different views of the world, ways that they wanted to operate, needs, et cetera. And so kind of trying to meet them on the level was super valuable. While I was working there, I ended up on what was supposed to be a 3-month engagement with a small startup called Houseparty in anticipation of their Series C fundraise. Very quickly, that started to feel like a longer term home. Became very close with several of the people I worked with there, some of whom I still work with. So then kind of, took that on, went in-house for the first time. And, the focus at first was really, we had this social video consumer app that was growing really, really quickly. And we needed to scale up mostly in like engineering functions, but also across marketing, finance, a lot of corporate functions as well. Um, Fast forward a little bit, the needs of the company kind of shifted based on basically what was going on with the product and sort of like the life cycle of the company, and a lot of the needs just sort of shifted over to the HR side. And so I tried to shift focus with it and see what I could do there to help create leverage. That ultimately led to the acquisition of Houseparty by Epic Games, where it seemed like there was a need for a lot of 0 to 1 type work in areas where the company, which at that point I think had grown from several hundred to maybe 1,500 in a few years, and hadn't really scaled up a lot of its core operating model, like needed to catch up, right? And then when I was there, it probably went from 1,500 to 4,000. So the role I played was kind of like a internal consultant, in air quotes, basically trying to 0 to 1 these different people processes that weren't at a level of maturity at a company level where we sort of knew what we needed in terms of like enterprise software solutions or anything like that, but we knew that we had to get out of email and Google Sheets. So kind of a figure out who we are process. That was a super rich learning experience, and after a few years I really had the itch to go back into the startup world, where we met, and I ended up working at a company called Curated that focuses on matching shoppers with experts for things that are complicated and expensive, essentially, to kind of enrich and ease the purchase flow for stuff like that. Long story short, I really started missing some of the people that I'd worked with previously at Houseparty and Epic, and the call came and made the tough decision to join up at WeightWatchers, where previously Seema Sistani, who was the CEO at Houseparty, is now the CEO at WeightWatchers. So getting the band back together.
That's awesome. I will just do a quick plug for more of your work and how impactful it's been. I met Seema through another conversation that I think you connected us on, and she said she was putting her band back together per se, and she wasn't looking for me, she was looking for you, but she didn't think she could get you. So when she talked about how is she going to put people who really understand scale and efficiency and innovation and transformation, she had you earmarked as one of those people that can go up and down. And I think you actually just hit on it, because is that 3 times now where you've been brought in to scale up. And then this happens all the time, or this happened over a couple of decades of my own career too, that you get hired on to do one thing and you almost work yourself out of a job. If you're really good at what you do and you have built the resources and the capabilities and the structure to go up, all of a sudden to have to go down is completely, it's not at all intuitive, and you have to completely flex and shift into a different mindset and use what you learn to go up to go back down. And I think you see a lot of people fail in that. I think it would be fascinating for people to hear, even myself, when that call first came, the first or the second or the third time, about, okay, now you've achieved your goals, you've gone through the really messy part of volume hiring, now we're going to stop, and now we're going to get really core on managing. What did you shift? What did you learn? And what were kind of your takeaways from anyone who may be going through that right now? Because it's, this is the climate we're living in. Right.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think that like a lot of the differentiators between sort of acquisition and retention come from how high level business objectives that are the same, whichever side you're on, get translated into different sets of incentives, right? So for instance, like whether you are an HR person or a recruiter or an engineer or a marketer, your CEO wants the same thing. And hopefully that is well aligned with a great company outcome. What I think happens is, depending on the seat that you're in, you sort of translate whatever that ultimate vision is into a set of incentives that make sense for you and for your team. So for instance, recruiting, you want to hire a certain number of people, but you don't just want to hire a certain number of people. You want to hire really great people who actually are
Mhm.
able to build and ship awesome product, bring that product to market, et cetera, et cetera. And what I think sometimes happens is you build a set of incentives that don't fully represent like the company level objectives you're trying to meet. So I think that's like the first thing I would highlight is if you're really effective in terms of how you are self-evaluating and how you're thinking about the performance of your team or your program or whatever it is that you sort of your sandbox, um, figuring out a graceful way to sort of comprehensively map what good looks like for you that as closely as possible aligns with what your CEO might think is the objective, right? Because they're not always the
Mhm.
same. I think we have a tendency to descope so that everything kind of fits within, the world that we can control. So I know I'm kind of like walking around the question you asked. I think if you're able to do that, which is already really hard, and basically say, okay, um, as a head of recruiting, I have a set of goals for myself and my team that I feel are well aligned with what we're actually trying to do at a company level and won't sort of lead us astray if left unchecked. If I've done that, then I think it really just becomes a matter of the tactics that you're using to actually like work your way up toward that high level goal. So if you're on the talent management side, you might be thinking about performance management and career frameworks and things like that. If you're on the recruiting side, you're thinking about how do we hire the best possible people. Um, and if you're really thinking about it, I think with a lot of rigor, like, on a cost basis perspective, from the perspective of like critical skills, critical talent, all of these different things, so that we're building a nice, fully balanced org that's able to actually hit the goals we're trying to hit as a company. Like if you're doing that, ultimately you're just thinking about how to programatize the same high level goal. So it's not as big of a shift, but the problem is it gets translated into very different sets of incentives along the way.
Yeah, completely. And it seems like, um, well, I don't want to lead the question on that. What, as you're thinking about balancing the needs of the business and the needs of the organization that's supporting the business, what data are you translating to your executive team or even in your own decision support about are we achieving the goals in real time versus, waiting for quarterly or 6 month out QBRs? Like, what are you watching on a real time basis that you feel like that's the data that you're going to communicate to the executive team because things are changing so quickly in the market, right? You've got volume, supply chain, offer letter accepts, declines, attrition that's just complete chaos. But what do you land in there to make sure that you are satisfying that need for quality from your executive team or your business sponsors?
Yeah. So candidly, I don't think we do anything too fancy. Um, I really believe like simple is better than complicated as a general
Yeah.
policy. Um, and so we look at some pretty usual suspects, right? We look at time to hire, time to fill, um, offer accept rate, time and stage, to make sure that we're running a fast, efficient, lean process. We'll look at conversions kind of benchmarked either against like the industry or benchmarked against other teams or roles at the company to understand more from like a diagnostic perspective what we can do to actually level up, become more efficient, become more effective, et cetera. But yeah, in terms of what we're surfacing at it, like an executive level, we try to keep it pretty simple. I think there's always that risk of kind of just devolving into like number spaghetti and not really having like a clean, cohesive 2 sentences narrative on like here's how it's going. The other big thing that we're really focused on right now is um, like quality of hire. So really trying to move away from like a butts in seats recruiting model, and really focus on hiring for sort of specific needs with a high degree of precision and really understanding over like the long tail, like as an employee, did we hire the right person and is that person really contributing to the mission and the high level goals in a meaningful way. So that would be the
Okay.
one unique.
I would love to go there for a second because I've probably been asked a dozen times in my career how I measure quality of hire, and I've never come up with a simple answer. And I know that you're reasonably new, 6 weeks into your current role, and I understand you're completely in the weeds and trying to figure it out. But what is your, 1 to 8 sentence answer for how any organization, regardless of size, can be thinking about measuring quality of hire? Like, what specifically are you looking at to give that answer?
Yeah, well, I'm surprised if I haven't asked you outside of this call for advice yet. I'm surprised. Um, yeah, I think for us, it's largely a tiered exercise because the sort of philosophical right way to do this, from my perspective, is ultimately to couch it in the performance of your employees. But to do that and to use that in any kind of actionable way as a recruiting team, you're looking at like, a year plus of lead time to get the
Right.
data. So, in an ideal world, if you have a really high fidelity performance process, you can sort of couch it in performance reviews and then walk backward. And if you triangulate that with interview processes, like what can we learn there? But basically, I would do it as like a cohort analysis, right? So people
Mm,
hired Q1 of this year, how do their performance scores on average 18 months in compared to those hired in Q2, et cetera? Um, we don't all have 18 months to answer some of these questions,
right.
nor would I advocate for like moving at that speed. So that's kind of like the goals version, right? And I think you shouldn't skip it, but it's also not super actionable. Um, I just try to think about like the most simple ways to get at what you're after. So with all like transparency, we are still figuring out what the right version of this is for us. But what I'm kind of circling is like some version of like average scorecard, um, right?
Oh.
Or
Mhm.
or some threshold, maybe a combination of the two, where you're getting some number of meaningful, high quality shots on goal per hire. So, for instance, are we providing our hiring managers with a high degree of choice so that they are actually choosing the best among several great options versus kind of being like super eager because they've been waiting for months and months and take the first person who comes along who seems like they can do the job.
Have you ever seen it done well? I haven't either. Do you think it's possible to do it really well?
Um, I mean, yeah, like I don't know. I've read books where they say that it's done well somewhere somehow. I think if you're like a Meta or a Google and you have a team of data scientists and really
Yeah.
top-notch operators that are exclusively dedicated to solving problems like these, you can probably figure out something really good. Um, but I also think there's like diminishing returns, right? There's probably a lot you can do by being scrappy and circling one or two things that you believe are going to be high enough signal indicators of whatever it is you're trying to do that like, solve for the 80%.
I think that's great advice, and something that we're going to get into here in a little bit is tips that you've learned along the way. That's keeping it simple, because I think with all of the data sources that we have out there right now, even though none of them really seem to sync together, keeping it simple and making sure that your leadership team knows exactly what you're going to be measuring, why you're going to be measuring it, and that's the most important thing, and not continue to add on your flavor, new leader to the team or executive, on what you think is a quality hire or the right time to hire ratio or the right offer accept ratio. um, Dialing it down in a really simple digestible way, I think, is great advice for anybody. Because I think a lot of people, seasoned individuals as well, come from maybe bigger institutions where there's that version and that flavor, but it doesn't mean it's a mix for where you are today. And on that note, because I learned a lot about different KPIs from you when we were walking through some of your processes at Curated together. Um, have you seen KPIs shift from pre-COVID to, post 2020, and even in sort of the last economic downturn that we're still, I think, cuspy on? Are you seeing the need or the request or the accessibility of the data shift in what's considered core for KPIs?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. I'll kind of combine like the LinkedIn chatter and like Medium posts and things like that that I try to kind of keep an eye on with personal experience. So take it with a grain of salt. Um, I think what I'm seeing is like there is the sort of supply demand equilibrium for talent has moved quite a bit.
Mhm.
We are much more in a buyer's market now than we were 3 years ago. Um, Whatever the war for talent was, like I'm not sure if anybody won. Maybe it's like a mutually assured destruction scenario.
Yeah.
But in any event, I think for a long time there was really this emphasis on like we at all costs need to just find a way to attract and retain whatever this like tier of people we think we need is, and then we'll figure out the rest later. I think now, both because there are more people looking for jobs and because money is more expensive, right? You have banks failing. Um, the focus has really shifted to efficiency. Um,
Mhm.
COVID, the COVID of it all, with like sort of work from anywhere, hybrid, remote work, all that, I think has also kind of like pushed things in this direction where, sort of phase one of this was like, okay, great. So um, we're not all going into the office. So why do I need to stay in the Bay Area? And you have all these people moving to, whatever, Seattle, Denver, Bend, all kinds of interesting places. Um, and then thing two is companies following suit and saying, okay, well, things still seem to be working okay. So maybe from a cost basis perspective, we would be well served to hire in not the most expensive market in the country. And so then companies start leaning into this model and finding leverage in that. And I think where it's starting to shift now is you're seeing a big push to like globalize that same concept. So if the answer is that hiring in Atlanta is more cost effective than hiring in San Francisco, like maybe the case is that it is more cost effective still to hire in Mexico City,
Mhm.
or Bogota or Lisbon or whatever. And I think what we're finding is when you start just kind of throwing out a couple lines in the water and like exploring that idea, there are some extremely smart people all over the world. And not everyone has the same cost of living, cost of labor. And so I think what I'm seeing is companies moving from this sort of like acquisition at all cost perspective to really trying to cost optimize and really globalize their approach to doing so.
Are you using the term globalized approach, meaning that you're doing a median compensation band for every particular role? Or what do you think, or what are you seeing as the trend for geo-specific, zone-specific compensation versus generalized, non-geo-specific?
Um, I think this is again an area where it gets really, really complicated the deeper
Mhm.
you go. And I don't know if you ever get to a place where you feel like you've turned over every stone. So um I th- I think I would approach it from like an equity perspective, right? How wide a brush can you paint with while still being generally fair to the population groups that you're talking about? Um, I mean, all the while there are companies as well who are bucking this trend altogether and saying like, we derive the same value from your work no matter where you are, so we're going to pay you something
Right.
like, as a default. Um, I think there's cases for both sides, but practically speaking, it seems to me like more companies are headed in the direction of like we are going to scale our compensation model with the cost of living or the cost of labor, whatever metric you use in a specific area. If you're doing it at a country level, usually what I see is like cities that are notably expensive get plucked out, and then there's like a rest of country number, right? So you might have
Oh, okay.
London, and London will have its own sort of bands, and then you'll have like a UK number.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm grappling with that right now with one of the situations that we're in. So um, we'll lift out of that one a little bit. The last thing I'll say on that is I know you've written a lot of Tableau skins on top of ATSs and Excel and Google Sheets to either make a point or answer a question for an executive. Have you ever been able to satisfy somebody who has a complete, quest for every single piece of data in order to make a decision? Have you figured out a way to triangulate that or create a system that actually works without hiring a team of, borrowing teams from corp dev and biz ops and technical program managers to help really think about budget implications as we're running scenarios and answering questions from leadership about cost reductions or spend run?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of there's like that meme where it's like the three like Spider-Mans all pointing at each other. I feel like that's like constantly the state of like people teams, executive teams, and finance, and they're all like, "Wait,
Totally. Yeah.
execute this one." Um,
Yeah.
no, I mean, I think um, there's a seemingly endless desire for tons of different cuts of data in a ton of different ways. Um, and there are definitely I've definitely had stakeholders where it's like there's no amount will ever truly like be satisfactory. I think the things that I've learned on this front are one, time permitting, it really behooves you to roll up your sleeves and get in the raw data, at least for a little while. Know how it's structured, understand where the bodies are buried. Like, um, I, a lot of us are like in this business because we like talking to people and we are passionate about building relationships, not because we are like through and through like systems people. And
Yeah.
so, as I'm sure you know, like recruiting systems, HR systems in general are like notoriously lossy when it comes to data quality. So, thing one is you can help to lead a little bit and help to satiate some of the thirst for data by actually drawing parameters around what you can and can't do, right? So
Okay.
if you're
That's
getting
a
if
good
you're
point.
getting a dozen requests in for something that ultimately you don't have good data on, there's a way to communicate that it's an unanswerable question with the way that we're sort of like resourced today that actually builds trust. Right? I think our tendency, again, as many of us are, like people, like we want to say yes to things, right? We want people to
Yeah.
be happy. We want to match make. We want to do all this stuff. But at the end of the day, there is a way to lead with confidence and build credibility and respect and sort of give your stakeholders something, a valuable piece of information in itself, by saying like, hey, it's awesome that you would love to know X, Y, and Z, and I can see how that might inform this question that is important to you. It's really not available to us right now, and here's why. And if we needed to change that, here's what that might look like. So that's one thing you can do to kind of hedge a little bit. I think once you're past the point of like having your sleeves all the way rolled up, just in it, um, thinking about your stakeholder groups and building some kind of system that is super modular is a big unlock. So if you don't have kind of like the out of the box budget or Tableau or whatever to do something that you feel like you can really like play with and kind of answer ad hoc questions, an easy way to do it is just pop open like a Google Sheet or Excel or something and have regular reports that you run out of your source of truth. Just drop them in, just overwrite them each time, and then pre-build your tables or pivot tables or however you're going to do it, your charts, and just constantly be refreshing the data and create a couple like drop downs so that you can basically say, oh, I want to see this by executive or by job family or whatever, so that you are able to dig fairly deep, at least on a number of key questions. So maybe you start by picking five, and it's like, we're going to be able to answer time to fill, offer accept rate, um, pass through rates for our funnel, and whatever, right? Like two other things. And you're just going to say, like, we're going to be able to answer that by job family, by hiring manager, by executive, and two other things. And then you've at least set yourself up to be able to do a fair amount on the fly because you spent the 6 hours just like building
The
building the
set.
face of whatever, you're just going to keep enriching with an underlying data set.
Okay, so this is why Seema hired you, having been a CEO now at two companies where she's brought you in, is I know you can do this on the fly. The rest of us have been looking for tools, and one of the reasons I'm so interested to talk to you and actually the product that's behind all of this that we're not going to go into. But I want to stay on that vein for a second because I
Yeah.
think I'm sure that you've matured into this over the years. Do you have a particular moment in your career or a war story where you sort of reflected and realized I have to be able to communicate what my clear data sets and KPIs are because I'm not going to be able to influence unless I become really articulate about what we can and cannot do. And then a time that you got into a situation and you just couldn't convince anyone about what was possible and what was not possible. It's like I have about five of those, but I'd love to hear if you have any in the background that you're like, yeah, this is it. I have to completely change my way of thinking and leading.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that comes to mind for me was definitely, yeah, I was working at Epic where people were asking all the right questions, and there was a sense that we should be able to answer these questions, but our systems just were not at a level of maturity, and we weren't sort of adequately resourced to do so. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, it was really, I don't know. I was not intentional about this at all. It was just something that needed to get done, and it clearly was a gap and an area of need. And so all this stuff about rolling up my, sleeves and like digging in the data, it totally came out of necessity, right? It was just we just didn't have the infrastructure to do it any other way. And two people would try to answer what seemed like a fairly simple question and would come up with two separate numbers. And so it just begged the question, like, what's going on underneath all of this? So
Mhm.
I think a lot of it comes from necessity. And if I can turn that into like a pointer or something that's been useful for me in my career, it's like don't um don't worry about adhering too closely to however your role was scoped out. Especially if you're working at a smaller company, like there are no small roles. Think critically about the most important work that needs to get done. Talk to people. Don't hold that so close that nobody knows why you're off in the weeds doing some other thing that nobody asked you to do. But like there's a lot to be said for just finding problems that need to get solved and trying to figure them out.
So that's number two for those keeping track at home about things that they should be writing down. I think, in particular, you have managed to figure out a communication style or a presence about you that it seems that you assume nothing when it comes to data or how something should get done. I know from early on, like you ask lots and lots of questions, you never start with answers. And I think that does build trust and credibility. So for those who might be listening to this and are earlier in career or thinking about making a shift from TAHR into ops and data, that would be my number one point that you are exemplary on. Just no ego, extremely humble, incredibly inquisitive about what are the problems that we're trying to solve and making sure you know exactly, you've really refined the problem before you come up with any type of assertion or answer. And you do that beautifully. Um, is there
It's
anything else in there that you've learned? Sorry, go ahead.
it's a recruiting principle too, right? Like I feel like
Yeah.
if I think about the highest signal recruiter screens that I ever had, it's time that you spend going deep enough on something that you're asking the second and the third follow-up question. You know,
Hmm.
the same principle applies, I think.
That's okay. So that's super helpful too for somebody who's in purely a TA recruiting type of role. If that's a natural way of working for them to go deeper and to take the cues and continue to ask questions, that will build a probably a meaningful approach to talent operations. Anything else as we kind of close out and start thinking about the value that we're hoping this provides to people who are listening about what would you tell yourself earlier in career that maybe you wished you'd mastered or thought of sooner, or any aha moments that have come late in your career that you would be willing to share?
Yeah, I got a couple. First one, there's a lot of literature out there about how to do this stuff, right? There's
Hmm. so
hundreds of
much.
books about all of it. Uh, and it's worth checking them out. They're not all going to be useful. And so like what I always have to remind myself is like there's no award for finishing the book or for, just doing the work or whatever. So read as much as you can and just try and absorb and, read 10 pages of something and decide that you already know it or it's not for you or whatever. Like skim the conclusions and go on to the next thing. But like always, I think be looking for new information and trying to find ways that people are doing things that might challenge your way of thinking about them. I think has been huge for me. Um, the other one I think is stakeholder mapping. So I think when I first was exposed to the idea of really building a thoughtful stakeholder map, it felt somewhere between like a business school exercise and like something sneaky you were trying to do to figure out how to like manipulate people or I don't know. Like the whole thing was very weird to me. And now it's something that I do all the time, not for either of those reasons, but because I think that understanding what the key people in your circle value and understanding what's important to them will help you to put them first and see the world through their eyes so that you can actually provide an excellent level of service to them, whether that's a candidate or your CEO, chief people officer, people on your team, like anyone. I think being able to really be programmatic about putting them first and seeing the world through their eyes will help you kind of like build everything else in terms of how you can work with them effectively.
I think that's one of the most important things I've heard anyone say. Because we so often go in with our own assumptions about what's important to someone and completely build a trail or a way of working around that never quite hits the goal. And for some reason, we can't figure that out.
I have one
So,
more on that front, actually.
oh yeah, that's it.
Um, when you go about building something, if you can't explain in 2 sentences what problem you're solving, it's a flag. And like I catch myself on this all the time. I have a tendency to overcomplicate. If you can't really succinctly distill down what it is you're solving for, like think long and hard before you set out building it.
Perfect advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. It was really great to spend time with you. I learn something every time we get together. So I hope this was valuable for those who are listening. And at Team Ohana, we're super grateful to have you in the friend corner, continuing to give us your thoughts and advice. So thank you very much.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Take care. Bye bye.